Welcome to Intrinsic Motivation from a Homie's Perspective podcast, where we meet experts from all walks of life to learn their intrinsic motivation so that they can share it with the world. What do we have in store today? Stay tuned to find out more. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everybody out there in podcast land. This is Intrinsic Motivation from a Homie's Perspective. I am Hamza.
And I am David.
And today, folks, I am actually going to post this podcast on our SoundCloud account in iTunes today because it is Green Day and it is the Super Bowl, and my Eagles are going to be there. And first and foremost, I have to say I'm happy regardless of the outcome. I guess I have to say that.
And I'm with you on that one.
It's been so long since we've been there, and the last time we were there, we played the Patriots and lost. So I am really excited about it. So today is actually a good day for me because I like to live every day to the fullest, and if I had a perfect day, it would include our podcast guest today. We have Sarah Brown on, and she is the author of The Book of You, and she's going to tell us about relationships and all the beautiful things going on in her life. What I'm really excited about is her TED Talk, and she talked about what my job taught me about finding a romantic partner. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Sarah to the podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Go Eagles.
Now, you are my best friend because you actually echoed my sentiment with the Green Eagles. What's your take on the Super Bowl today?
Oh, well, I'm going for the underdogs, but I'm with you. I'm just so happy that they're in the game that regardless of the outcome, it's going to be fine.
Nice. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I actually resonate a lot with your background and what have you. And I think many people that listen to the podcast, there are a lot of people that have had a corporate association or identity and then, had to use that experience to branch onto other realms. And you've had extensive experience with Arthur Andersen Consulting, Accenture, right? You've gone through so many changes with even the Accenture umbrella. I'd like to have you spend some time about your experience in the corporate world during that time.
During the time of Accenture?
Yes.
Well, I actually got to Accenture through a very large IT outsourcing deal that was done between DuPont and Computer Sciences Corporation, CSC, and what was then Andersen Consulting. And the deal has been eclipsed many times since then. But at the time, in 1997, it was the largest outsourcing deal that had ever been done. So it was history-making, and it was a big, big change. And I was really excited to join Accenture because my background is in organization development, and that my doctorate is in a field called psychoeducational processes, which is a combination of group psychology and adult learning. And I was doing a lot of change management work in DuPont at the time. But when I looked across and saw all the talent in Accenture, then Andersen Consulting, I was really excited about joining them. And it turned out to be everything that I thought it was going to be. But then, as you said, there was a great big change that occurred just a few years after that. It was less than 4 years after I joined the company. There was a big separation between the accounting side of the business and the consulting side of the business. And that's when Accenture came into being, and I became a part of that organization. And that was tumultuous, but it was exciting, and it's turned out to be really good for the consulting side of the business anyway.
I'm laughing because you said tumultuous, and at the time, I guess we can always say that being 2020, but at the time it was just so I just remember my older compadres, they would come back to school when they were Anderson or Arthur Anderson, and then, when they broke up the Big Eight, and you had Anderson Consulting, and then, my era was a lot of people going to Accenture, and some people are still there in the consulting arm. So it's just really interesting speaking with anyone that had that experience, because they don't just hire anyone. So that speaks volumes about your expertise.
Oh, well, thank you. It's a great, intense culture, and it was a really good experience for me.
So organizational development, what does that mean, actually?
It takes on different guises depending on the situation, but it has to do with how you orchestrate change within a large organization. And the way I was practicing it, and where most of my expertise lay, was in designing the change and making sure everybody was ready for the way technology was going to impact the way people work. So I would work on the front end of very large IT projects, helping to redesign the processes, to train the employees that would be using the technology differently, and to make sure that everybody that was impacted by the change was ready for that change to occur.
Now, I'm one of those people that I usually don't like watching things twice, but one of the things that I really enjoy watching is the old Seinfeld episodes. And they had an episode just the other day where Jerry had missed out on some information because he didn't have email. And he was like, I got to get on the internet. And the year is 97, right? And we're 2018, so we could kind of laugh at it. But I'll bring it up because, with your expertise in organizational development, and orchestrating change in the corporate environment is a lot different today than it was back then. What are the similarities, and how have we transformed tremendously from 1997?
Well, it's interesting that you bring up that topic of email. When I did my dissertation in the early 1990s, it's when email was just coming on the scene in a big way. And my dissertation topic was actually how email was changing the decision-making culture within organizations. And it branched out a little bit into how technology was impacting organizations. And what it was doing was it was allowing people to make decisions and to interact from afar, much more so than they had ever done in the past. They didn't have to be face-to-face. And so they were learning, how do we do things like sense what people are actually saying? How do we actually bring groups together? So that, in a sense, is still what happens when you introduce new technologies. People are learning how to do that a little bit differently. But the big change in the 1990s was how people were learning how to do it from afar without actually looking at each other eyeball to eyeball.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's just, if you think about it, at that time, you still had to physically go to a desktop to send that email, which kind of seems foreign in itself.
Exactly. Yeah. I had one of the very first cell phones or mobile phones, and it was bigger than a shoebox. So it was hardly mobile, and it weighed a ton. But that was our first overture into, quote, mobile technologies, and it wasn't really all that easy. So things have gotten a lot lighter. It's a lot easier to move, and we're much more comfortable, I think, these days dealing with people from afar and picking up on cues that we can't always see.
Yeah, it's interesting because we have now in the workplace and there's a reason why I'm asking these. We'll get to the relationship part, but you have three, in essence, generations working in an environment. Now you have baby boomers, Generation X, you have millennials, and they all view communication differently. Case in point, I had just recently watched the Denzel Washington movie, Roman Israel Esquire. Have you seen that?
No, I haven't.
No.
It's I'm a Denzel fan, so of course I'm going to have a bias. But the reason why I bring it up is he's an attorney, but he's more of an old school attorney, and something happens where his business partner, he transitions, and so Denzel's used to working in the background, and he gets into this environment where people are like, "Did you answer my email?" And he's like, people expect an immediate response from somebody sending an email. And to the other person that was questioning him about it, yes, I sent you an email. I'm expecting a response. And he's a baby boomer, so he's like, I'll get to it when I get to it.
Yeah.
I bring it up for business, and we'll get to the relationship part. But the reason why I bring that up is I was recently at a networking event. Surprise. And so I was talking to this young lady, and she was talking about her boyfriend, and she was upset. And she was I want to say she was a Generation Xer. So I don't want to say she was, totally demanding, but she was saying that he was more responsive and in greater communication with his job than he was with her. He would tell the job he's going to be late, or I'm in a meeting, or, and for her, she felt kind of left out in the cold because he wasn't as responsive to her. And with your background, I'm just wondering if you're seeing a lot of overlap or any difference between a person's professional life and their personal life.
Occasionally I do, and occasionally they're patterns. I don't think there are any generalities that we can draw from that. A lot has to do with the difference between somebody's usual style or their strengths and their needs. And typically what I see is that you see more interaction with needs in a romantic relationship than you do with strengths or typical style. You see more of that at work. And those two things, although they typically are measuring the same behavior, they can be different. So just because I follow a very strong, rigorous schedule at work doesn't mean that I'm going to do it at home, because my need is entirely different. So that's where I see the difference is that an individual's needs typically play out more at home because they're more comfortable. And they're looking to regenerate and get their needs met. And at work, they're typically working from their socialized usual behavior, their strengths, where they've learned how to be successful. Another case in point is my husband is typically in the workplace, in his profession, he is viewed as the Energizer Bunny. He is always on the go. He's always doing things. He's really moving at a rapid clip. When he gets home, he shuts down. And that's because his need for pace of action is radically different than the way he usually behaves. And so what people are often surprised at is when they ask us what we did over a weekend, and I say, nothing. They say, how can he do that? And I said, well, that's his need. And so it just plays into his need, which is playing out in an environment in which he's more comfortable than his usual style.
I'm so excited to talk to you, Sarah. I don't want to take over the whole hour, so I'd like to actually have David jump in right now.
Well, I was going to ask, when did the light bulb go off that you realized this relationship between, what people needed and when they were looking for jobs and what they were looking for in relationships? How did that come about?
It actually came about when I met my husband. He was putting me through a very rigorous process, and I didn't like it much. And it's actually the story that I tell in my TEDx talk. And it hit me in that moment when he was putting me through that process that the process of finding and screening for a romantic partner is very much like the process of screening for a job. And I started thinking about the questions that are most frequently asked during a job interview so that I could prepare myself for this process he was putting me through, and realized I could be asking the questions the same as anybody else. So the first question that an employer always asks is why do you want this job? And what they're looking for is to figure out if you have interests and or passions, but mostly interests, that align with theirs so that you'll be happy on the job. The happier the employee is, the less likely they are to leave. So if you look at your interests and your partner's interests, you can figure out, do we have enough that we can do together, that we're going to be happy spending time together because we both like the same kinds of activities? And if we don't, can we carve out time separately so that each of us can spend time on our respective interests? The second question that an employer asks is why do you think you'll be successful on the job? And what they're looking for in that case is do you have the skills and the strength behaviors to actually be successful? And the corollary in a relationship is this: will you get to use your strengths rather than having to always operate from a position of something that is not in your wheelhouse? And the example that I usually give on that is what a colleague of mine, Dan Perryman, taught me about. It's a Star Trek analogy, the difference between Mr. Spock and Captain Kirk. Mr. Spock is all fact, no fiction, just give me what I need to know to solve the problem. On the other end of the spectrum is Captain Kirk, who is warm and empathetic and can listen to anybody. Neither one is right or wrong. It depends upon the situation. And it depends in a relationship around what your partner is looking for, whether they want to interact with somebody who is fact and no fiction like a Mr. Spock, or whether they need somebody who's just listening to them like a Captain Kirk. And everybody is different. So what you want to be sensing when you're screening for a partner is how much do I tend to operate one way or the other, and is my partner going to be comfortable with that so that I don't have to flex too much out of my comfort zone? The other part of that question has to do with relationship skills, and this is another thing employers want to know is, do you know how to get along? Do you know how to deal with differences? And the interesting thing about that is it's a learnable skill. And that's what I am really working on, is helping people understand what those differences are and how they can craft the rules for what I call fighting fair, so that they can deal effectively with those differences. The third question an employer always asks is why do you think you'll fit into our organization? And what they want to know is are your needs going to be compatible with the culture of the organization? And are your strengths going to not create stress for their employees? And you want to know the same thing in a relationship. You want to know, will your partner's strength behaviors meet your needs? Do you know enough about what your needs are that you can ask for what you want? So I realized just in that process that we could more effectively screen for a partner by using that job interviewing guide as a template for how we go about it.
Wow. That's interesting.
And I really highly suggest that people check out what my job taught me about finding a romantic partner. It's a great TED Talk, less than 15 minutes, and if you're like me and watch it in 2X, you can see it in less than 10 minutes. So highly recommended. And I want to bring this up because a woman said it, so I don't get hate mail later because I asked this question. So this woman, a friend of mine, she had mentioned you were talking about your husband and his needs and what happens like during the weekend or what have you. And she said, through she and her husband's relationship, they identified that, and this is a huge generalization, I got to throw a lot of asterisks around this. So, right. So anyway, she was saying that if we were to look at ourselves as computers, men have maybe 5,000 words that they say per day. And after they use that 5,000, they're pretty much done. Women have maybe 10 to 15,000 words that they say per day, and then maybe they're done. So if they both go to work and a guy uses that potentially that 5,000 words during the day, he's depleted. He really has to recharge until the next day. He can't contribute in the home life. I wanted to get your take on that, Sarah.
I echo what you said about that's a huge generalization. I, for one, am in the 5,000-word category. If I'm at work and I'm doing a lot of talking, when I get home, the last thing I want to do is talk.
Just talk, yeah.
So I think it's more personalized than we think it is.
Mm-hmm. And it makes me think of whatever your profession is. Also, I've known that in my personal experience, I've had conversations with both personal and professionally with other women that may be in sales or if they're on the phone all day. And if either of those two variables exist, then they really don't want to talk outside of work.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I do think it's more personalized than we think it is.
Yeah. The other question I have, because you were asking about, the first part is the only not pushback, because I think you and I kind of have the same ilk, in that it was easy for you to make the parallels between work life and personal life, hence the job interview aspect. I'd like for you to talk a little bit about your TED Talk. When was it? I mean, I know the answer, but when was it? And do you see that it still exists today? Because some of the technology that was used back then, we have a plethora of things that can overcome that today.
I think you're asking when was the story that I told about on my TEDx Talk? Yeah. I met my husband in 1994.
Okay.
So it was, and I kind of make a joke about it because we actually met through a personal ad, which was the precursor to a lot of the dating sites that are available today. It was a similar type process. And in 1994, it was still relatively new as a way to meet partners. And the second part of your question is what has changed today. And I think what has changed today, and it's one of the reasons I was asked to give this TEDx talk, is that technology is available today to help us develop insights that we could not do as easily in 1994 when I originally met my husband. So there are tools available today to help us explore those differences. And the business world has known about it for years. The business world has been using tools. They haven't always been automated, but they've been using teamwork tools for years and years, and they since have become more automated and online. And that's happening in the personal sphere as well, is these tools are becoming available that help us to develop insights about ourselves and our partners and to explore the differences and the way we can manage those differences in a more creative way.
My personal experience is sometimes I would potentially get yelled at for being Mr. quote-unquote Mr. Davis, right? And I say that to say, if I look at it from a business standpoint, it's a win-win, right? That's a definite vernacular business, right? How can both sides win? But there's no or it could be perceived as that's mechanical. It's no emotion into it. This isn't a business meeting. And a little bit of how your approach that resonates with me is if we have a positive outcome, then we both win, yeah? But that may not be the case. I think that you help people get on the same page, whereas sometimes if they don't have that same makeup in that beginning job interview, then when those issues come up, it kind of shows that you didn't go through the initial tools before you guys started getting together. What's your take on that?
The principle that I use for helping couples fight fair is that each partner is entitled to pursue his or her interests in some way and to get his or her needs met. And the creative process is around figuring out how you do that so that each party wins in that area. The difference in the business world, and the reason that what I'm advocating is not as pure transactional as it is in the business world, is the business world is looking at more tangible products and more tangible outcomes, like how does each side maximize their financial return, for example. And seldom do we hear discussions about what do you need, what do you emotionally need. So it's much more tangible in the business world. But the principle is the same, that we want each side to get to have a win. And by creatively looking at interests and needs, I think that it is possible that each side can get a win.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And it kind of, what I've seen, and I want to get your opinion on this as well, is, and I think we're going through another shift with, all of the headlines with workplace harassment and what have you, is there are a lot, and it's always been frowned upon with, HR really stepping in, but it seems like there has always been an increase of workplace romance just because they identify all of these points from the tangible, intangible, conflict resolution, varying interests and passions, and you spend a lot of time with this person versus the person that you actually live with. And what's your take on the current environment, and what are some steps that we can take to move past the turmoil that's going on right now?
Hamza, you broke up several times in that, so let me make sure I got the question correctly. You're talking about what are some steps that we can take to move on in the workplace?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I think the important thing to do to move on in the workplace is to understand that each individual in the workplace has a unique set of interests, strengths, and needs, and the needs are often hidden. And so the workplace in general can openly advocate for helping an individual pursue his or her interests and use his or her strengths. But the individual has to be responsible for getting the needs met, because they're typically not available and visible to the rest of the organization. And so they need to know what it is that they need, and they need to be able to ask for it in a creative fashion. So, for example, if there are individuals that thrive on an incredible amount of teamwork and group interaction, and they actually get energized by it. And there are those who do it and can do it well, but they don't get energized by it, and they actually need a substantial amount of time alone. I happen to be one of those in that category. So recognizing that individual needs to find ways to ask for a certain amount of time alone or in the company of one or two people, so that need can get met and they don't burn out. I had that situation at Accenture. Because we are a global organization, I could find myself on group conference calls from 6 o'clock in the morning until 10 o'clock at night. Mm-hmm. And I had to realize that was not how I was going to get my needs met. And when my needs aren't met, I'm not going to give the best to the organization. So I had to look at how I could get team members to cover me on some of those calls, so I could actually cut down on how much of that I was having to do. So those are the creative things that individuals need to do to get their needs met. And that goes beyond just basic respect. I think everybody is entitled to basic respect, and everyone needs to step up when basic respect is not being adhered to, and say, this is not basic respect and I need a little more of it, and I need some support from the organization to get it.
Mm-hmm. And I think the other thing, like you were saying, if your needs are met at work, then you're going to be happy at home as well. And with the market being the way it is, there's greater confidence and what have you. There are loosening of purse strings, so hiring is in full bloom, at least in early February 2018. And this is in an environment where in the past couple of years it wasn't like that. So people were pretty much taking jobs that they could get, maybe for less pay, or they're working longer than they're usually working for just because they had to. And I'd like to compare that environment of what you were seeing with your book, because your impetus was working at Accenture. There were people, on my standpoint, people wanted to work there, right? But you found people that were working there, but they figured out they were actually in the wrong place. They were miserable there. So what are some things that we could do as far as a self-analysis to get into something that we actually like?
Well, the very best thing to do is to get very much in touch with your interests, the day-to-day activities you love to do, your strengths, behaviors, and the best way to get in touch with that is to ask somebody else, what are my strengths? And your environmental needs, your motivational needs. What is it you need in the environment so that you thrive? And I always tell people, before you jump into a new job or try to start a new career, see if you can't get those things taken care of in the job that you're in. Find small adjustments like the ones that I made. Just getting off those group conference calls made a huge impact on my degree of satisfaction and my efficacy, actually, on the job. So you start there. You start getting very clear about what your interests, strengths, and needs are. Make the small changes on the job, and then, and only then, do you start looking at what a change might be that would be a better match. And there are lots of ways to go about finding matches that are better. Just telling your friends, just the age-old thing about networking. Here's what I think I'm interested in. Here's what I'm good at, and here's what I need. What ideas come to mind when you think about a job that embodies all of that? So you can get good ideas from your networks and your friends. There are very good tools out there now that do matching of your personality with the kinds of careers that people with personalities like yours have found to be satisfying and they've been successful in. I have one on thebookofyou.com, but it's just one of them. So I would say use technology and use your networks.
Mm-hmm. When did you come up with the idea of the Book of You series, Sarah?
The original idea came up about 5 years ago when I was still working at Accenture. I had a lot of clients. They happened to be mostly women at the time. They were mid-career professional women, and they were not working for Accenture. They were our clients, and they were in the wrong jobs, and they were miserable. And when I would ask them, what is it that you want, they couldn't answer the question. And that's what launched me into thinking about this in a whole new way. And I realized that we could use technology to help people get clear about what it is they wanted. And that forced me to really think about my job. I'd already made that small change, or a couple of small changes actually, but it forced me to really look at what would be the role that was most appropriate to me. And actually the best match for me is in an area of research and education and teaching, and so that's what and writing. And so that's what I decided to do. I decided that what I was going to do was to go back to a career that is actually a perfect match for my personality, and to write a book, to help write a series of books actually, to help people really get clear about their interests, strengths, and needs and what they can do about it. And so the Book of You was born out of that. I'm using technology to help me write a completely customized book for each individual based on his or her personality. So I give them a world-renowned personality assessment, and when I get the data back from that, we can generate a book just for them on a whole host of topics. And I call it the Book of You.
Wow. That does sound pretty individualized.
It makes me think of why we even started the podcast anyway, because like you mentioned, the majority of your clients were women, and women definitely are the ones that are looking at improving themselves and what have you. And, I wish the male species would actually step up for that because, it's not a level playing field. If to both people don't know what they want, it's bad. But if one person does and the other person doesn't, I've always heard that people grow differently. Are you finding a way when they do that Book of You individually that they're able to get their spouses on so they're on the same page?
Let me make sure I understand the question. I think you're asking me when they start getting clear about what's important to them, can they get their husband or their partner or their spouse aligned with it?
Right. Yeah.
I find I have not seen any major problems in that area. What I find is that the happier people get, and the more successful they get, the more comfortable they are in relationships. And so it's not been my experience that that's been an issue in relationships. But should it become an issue in relationships, I have a tool for that too, and that's what we call the Book of Two, where you can actually look at the differences between two individuals and figure out how to work through those issues.
Let's stay there for a second because out of the number of people that we've interviewed and just spoke with in passing, and this is a generalization again, so there's some asterisks there, but around the mid-30s, people start questioning, where do I go as far as my next phase of life? And, they get interested or introduced to these different modalities, and then it's in many cases it could be one-sided. And so, one spouse is super happy, like you said, and the other isn't. And so there's resentment or they're just not on the same page. And you're saying that with the Book of One or the Book of Two, they can actually not throw out all the years of being together. They can actually successfully go to the next phase of life together.
With the Book of Two, what you can do, no pun intended, I wasn't trying to make a rhyme, it just kind of came out like that. With the Book of Two, what you can do is creatively look at the personality differences so that you can craft your own rules for working through whatever is coming up for you. And again, I'm operating under the principle that everyone is entitled to pursue their interests and to get their needs met. I believe that's God-given. And so when we do that, we are living on purpose, and we're using our gifts for the betterment of all. And when you take the personality differences out of the equation, you can work so that everybody can do that.
It makes me think I'm a big movie buff, and I'm a Cancer, so I'm a big Will Ferrell fan. He's a fellow Cancer. It makes me think of the movie Old School, right? He was Frank the Tank, and he was the guy in college, and, he did things college kids do. And his wife was, she was kind of fed up with it. She dealt with it for a couple of years, and then, that wasn't her anymore. And so it sounds, just listening to you, that our needs constantly change. And our personality needs also change. So would you suggest that we evaluate personality change either yearly, or is there a time frame associated with looking at personalities? The needs that I am looking at and measuring don't actually change. The underlying tool that I'm using is called the Berkman method.
And Dr. Roger Berkman, who created all of this, did extensive research on this and found that our underlying personality needs do not change in the long term. We may suppress them, but they don't actually change over time. They remain relatively constant. So what I am trying to help people do is to understand what that is. Our interest areas don't typically change either. We may express them in different areas, like we may have a big interest in the arts, but the area of the arts, that's a wide field. We may express it entirely differently. So based on that research that he did that showed that these do not tend to change over the time, my premise is everybody is entitled to pursue that. They're God-given talents, and so the best thing that we can do is to make sure that everybody has a chance to express their interests and get their needs met, and the world will be a better place because of that. What we need to do is to find a way to mesh the differences together and find a way so that everybody can do that and so that there's not a lot of conflict in the process. And so the book of two that I developed is designed to do just that and to highlight what are our needs, because we often suppress it and don't know what they are. And so the book of two is designed to highlight that for two individuals and to make sure they're aware of it and to offer some guidance on how that couple can craft their own rules for fighting fair so that you can, in fact, get interests, strengths, and needs met.
Interesting. So, Sarah, let's say, for example, you had a couple or someone took that personality test, and let's say they were in their early 20s, and you say that those needs, they might not know they're always the same, and that if anything, they might hide them. If they took that test, let's say, when they were in their early 40s, like 20 years apart, it would show the results would be fairly the same. Is that what you're kind of saying?
That's what Dr. Berkman's research has shown, yes.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Now, the strength behaviors may change because that's socialized. You know, we practiced and learned that is a way to be successful. But for the most part, he has found that the needs are relatively constant over time.
Mm-hmm.
So let's address the popular Hollywood story that people beat up on or like to highlight. They say there's 1 million attorneys and only 10% really want to be attorneys, but attorneys, you can make money, right? So in essence, they're suppressing what they really want to do. And if they're suppressing for a significant amount of time, it could be in a marriage, they're learning, they're fighting unfair, they're breaking the rules. What are some indicators or some signs that there is a change that needs to be made? Because in many cases, there's so much suppression to the point where it blows up and then all bets are off, the game's over, and they're looking at, the worst case scenario. What are some indicators that they need to look at the book of one or the book of two?
It's interesting that you bring up an example of attorneys, because I have met so many attorneys that are in that situation. And the telltale sign is typically burnout. And so what I, again, tell even the attorneys to do is get very comfortable or very aware of your interests, your strengths, and your needs, but most importantly, your interests and your needs, and look at the way you can get that solved first and foremost in the legal profession, because there are lots of different kinds of attorneys. The kind of attorney that is doing a lot of work in a corporate structure is, structuring deals in the background and making sure that everything is iron tight is very different than the attorney that is on the front line of a trial case, for example. So I suggest again, get very clear about what your interests, strengths, and needs are. Look at how you can satisfy that in your current job or in the legal profession, even before you make a change.
Now, I have a technology question for you also, just watching the maturation of the market and going from personal ads to forums to where we are now. And in 2007, I believe Stanford had done a study about social media, and they had seen that people typically are tribal and like to more so hang around their groups. So in this study, MySpace was still around, and Facebook was slowly coming into prominence. And what they found was they did two different groups. They did a high school group, and then they did a military group. And in the high school group, if you were a jock or a cheerleader or, preppy, you were on Facebook. And if you were like a stoner or in a rock group or, a rapper or something, you were on MySpace. And same thing with the military. If you were a private, you were on MySpace. And if you were a captain or above, you were on Facebook. And I bring that up because my personal experience was I did my own experiment, somewhat like yours, but you actually got married to the person. And what I looked at was, there's a ton of free dating sites. So I was like, okay, let me see what kind of response I get off of free dating sites. And then I said, well, let me spend a couple $100 for eHarmony. And I'm not promoting any company, but so when I initially looked at it, the free ones I kind of looked at, those are MySpace, right? Your crazy Saturday night photos and all that. And then on eHarmony was your Facebook, your Owen Mills photo, if you will. And what I found was the same people were on different platforms. They were just presenting themselves differently. So it was interesting to me as to how people are malleable to their environment. And so you were talking about your personality needs pretty much stay the same and that they're constant, but I think people present themselves differently depending on what potentially expected of them.
I think that's probably true, and it would relate more to your strength behavior than to necessarily your interests and your needs. And so the sleuth work that is involved here, over and above whatever platform you happen to meet somebody on, is really getting clear about the individual's interests and needs, because they're not going to be readily apparent. You're going to operate more from your strength behaviors on those platforms, and the getting to know each other process is going to help you discover the interests and needs and the things that you're going to have to navigate and work through for the rest of the time you're in that relationship.
Good point. Very good point. Sounds like David was about to say something.
Oh, I was just kind of looking through the questions here.
Well, while you're waiting, I did have a question, Sarah, because you're using it from a business standpoint, and you had talked about interest and passion at work. And I was recently watching, I'm a big fan of Scott Adams. You know Scott Adams?
Yes.
Okay, great. So Scott was talking about Scott Adams, for people in the podcast land. He's most famously known as the creator of the Dilbert cartoons, and he's pretty vocal on social media and such about his opinions. And one thing that he talked about was interest versus passion. And I believe in one iteration of his life, he was working with a bank, and a person, you had two people come in saying they want a loan, and what they had told Scott was, if somebody comes in and they say, my passion is sports and I want to start a sports bar, right, don't give that person a loan. But if the other person comes in and says, I want to open another dry cleaning business, and it's not particularly my passion, but here are my profits and loss, my P&L reports, and I've been successful in 3 other businesses that are the same. And they're like, if they had a greater interest in that, give them the loan. So it was more of debunking passion. And I wanted to get your take on that from both a business standpoint versus, I hate to compartmentalize, but during our conversation, it's in my mind, I don't know, as a guy, it's hard to not differentiate interest versus passion, especially from a relationship standpoint.
Well, let me tell you a funny story about Dilbert. I love Dilbert cartoons, and in fact, they populate all of my book of views, licensed and legally used, of course.
Nice.
But the reason that I like Dilbert is because Dilbert doesn't take anything too seriously. Mm-hmm. In fact, there's a bit of irony and humor in everything that is depicted in those cartoons, and that's one of the reasons I use it, because I think those cartoons help us to, let's not take everything so seriously. Let's just kind of go with the flow a little bit. But let me speak specifically to the example that you gave, because yes, he's poking fun at something, but he's also highlighting in that particular example where interest and passion actually lies. Because in the example that you gave, somebody who loves sports may not love the activity and the aspect of running a business around sports. Mm-hmm. And in the second example that you gave, the individual really was loving the activity of looking at and tracking the profit and loss and figuring out where the return is going to come from. And so, yes, I might honor, if I'm thinking about giving a loan, somebody who loves dealing with that activity as opposed to somebody who just loves the activity of observing a sport.
That kind of totally makes sense. I mean, I've known people that have just loved the idea of owning a restaurant, but when it came down to it, they had no interest in running a business.
Or they have no activity of running or doing the activities involved in owning a restaurant.
Yeah, exactly.
And there's a third aspect of owning a restaurant, and that is that the environment in which you're working when you're an entrepreneur, where you're a sole proprietor, as is the case when you own a restaurant, is entirely different than the environment where you go to work every day in a corporate structure. And that's where needs come in. Because if your needs are not aligned with that entrepreneurial environment versus the corporate environment, you're going to find it a very difficult task, and you're going to find it stressful.
Yeah, completely agree.
It's a lot of confirmation bias during this podcast today. So let me. I guess I always like to talk funnels with people we speak with, Sarah. So I've identified that I need to evaluate personality needs, and I am led to your book of one. And then I'm so fired up, I'm jazzed. I tell my partner, and I introduce her to the book of two. And so now I bought the book of one, I bought the book of two. I know more about Sarah. I shared your TEDx video and such. What happens after that? Do you do more one-on-one? Do you do seminars? What happens after?
I do webinars.
Okay.
And I do some face-to-face seminars as well. But I periodically, when I have gathered up a group that is interested, will run webinars as well, where I can take the results from each individual, and as a group, we can explore what that means for individuals and on a personalized basis. So I keep the webinars small to groups of 10 or fewer so that we can delve in and be specific. And I typically organize those as soon as I have a group that's ready to go. You can actually order it. Talking about funnels, if you go to the bookofview.com, you'll have an option to actually sign up for one of those.
do you do, or are you finding in your back office, I'm always interested in conversion rate optimization, and so are you finding similarities in demographics when you have groups of 10, like I'm going to have people that like trucks or in this group of 10 and people that like the Eagles in that group of 10? Are you finding similarities in your audiences?
Well, I haven't found similarities like liking trucks or Eagles or country music or anything like that. I have found a lot of similarities just in people that are very interested in exploring what's next for them and getting the most out of their relationships and getting the most zest out of their careers and what they're doing in life.
Do you find that there's a particular age group that you work with more than any other?
Yeah, typically between 35 and 50.
You hit that generalization. Sorry.
I say that, although they're, that's mostly the age group that I'm working at. Although I am seeing a demographic increasing, and those are people that in their early 60s that are retiring early, and they're looking at what's next for me. Not so much from the relationship side as from what's next for me. So the Book of You side, I'm seeing that.
Oh, that's interesting. That kind of goes back to the David question, I guess my second part of that, and just checking in, for I see in business cycles you have the 10-year cycle and such, and you're saying if you're running into this new demographic of early 60s, it'd be interesting to see, kind of checking in. This is my snapshot, early 40s. This is my snapshot, early 50s, early 60s, early 70s.
Yeah.
Right, because it's a generalization, of course, midlife crisis, and we laugh about it. But right, if there's and I know it's individualized, but there has to be. I just think there's some outliers that exist. That wow, if we pinpoint 40, and everyone grows differently, of course. But I'm just compartmentalizing again my whole guy brain. So that's me thinking out loud.
Well, I do find, I'm not sure how to respond exactly to your question, but I do find in those that are retiring early and looking at what's next for me are not as concerned and as motivated by money and earning a living. So they are more interested in, they're more able to take a risk and pursue and experiment with avocations than with jobs, and that makes sense. Typically they've got a little more of a nest egg, and the amount of income is not as important as the satisfaction that comes from being in the right job and pursuing the right things.
Or quality of life, yeah.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Well, I was also thinking that staying with the early 60s, I'm really intrigued because you have, unfortunately, what top 3 killer is heart disease. And unfortunately, more and more women are having heart disease just for a number of factors, but there's additional stress. And at the early 60s, or the generalization is that women wind up living longer than men, and a lot of it could be attributed to their quality of life and how they process things. So I'd love to actually have you back in the future to talk about, the older generation and just different issues. As you mentioned, it's not so much money. It's more of other intangibles that at 40 or 30 you weren't thinking about.
I would be delighted.
So you said we're almost at the top of the hour. You're talking about your site and such. I'd love for you to give out your contact information so people can get in touch with you.
Yeah, my site is bookofyou.com. bookofyou.com, and if you're interested in the Book of Two, which is the couples tool, you'll see it right on the front page of bookofyou.com. So that's the easiest place to go. You can communicate with me that way, or that's the easiest place to go, just bookofyou.com.
One last thing is we are in that season, if artificial or not, but Valentine's is right around the corner. And what's your take on our Hallmark holiday? And is that when you get a majority of people evaluating or reevaluating and are led to your door?
Well, that's interesting. I think that we have a very set way around approaching Valentine's Day, which is that everybody wants to get chocolate and roses. And that's not always the case. And the important thing, I think, is to understand what is it that's going to light up your partner and how can you give that. And by getting really in touch with your partner's interests, strengths, and needs, you can personalize what you're actually giving your partner. It might be a massage. It might be just a quiet evening at home. That might be the most important thing. Or in the case of my husband, I know what he cares about most is a card, that's a really nice card that I've spent time thinking about with a personalized note on the inside.
Mm.
So my counsel is personalize it.
Absolutely. Yeah, personalize it. Especially for all the homies listening that are in the supermarket on Valentine's Day picking out cards. I think you missed the personalization. It was a joy speaking with you, Sarah. The hour flew by, and I love talking about your history and from everything from the personal ad in 1994 to how much you've grown to 2018. It was a pleasure.
Well, thank you so much. It was really a joy talking with you guys as well.
Yes, thank you so much. Go Eagles, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks again for checking out another episode of Intrinsic Motivation from a Homie's Perspective podcast. Please check us out on our website at intrinsicmotivation.life, where you can click on the Speak Pipe button and leave any suggestions for future podcasts that you'd like us to cover. Also, check us out on our social media sites. We have a YouTube channel, Facebook page, iTunes podcast, in addition to Stitcher and Google Play, all under Intrinsic Motivation from a Homie's Perspective. Check you out next time. Have a great day.